Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the majority party.
Thank you. It is an honor to be here tonight, beginning of this new year. It's been great being in East Texas this weekend, last weekend, hearing all the hope that has arisen as we've entered this new year, 2017. I think it's going to be a good year. I'm told that just on the basis of a new president coming in who's promising to throttle back, remove so much of the heavy iron boot off the throat of the economy, that firms are starting to hire again. Businesses are making plans to expand and grow. And then we're seeing the reports of plants that are deciding to stay in the United States instead of going elsewhere. There's a lot of optimism out there. There are young people that are asking what it was like when you came out of college and had multiple job opportunities for most of the people coming out of college, instead of opportunities to live with your parents or your grandparents or a parent or the other parent. They actually had multiple job opportunities, and that optimism has arisen. And as we enter this year also, it's very sad to see a form of racism and negativity that arises. And I've said before publicly, and I think it's still true. One need go back no further than the confirmation hearing for Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. But the more you look, the more you find that the most persecuted person to be in America these days is a conservative African American. If you're black and you're conservative, you can expect the slings and arrows and hate from all over the country. Vicious, mean. And it was yet another slap, as if the high-tech lynching of the Senate confirmation hearing, as grossly unfair as it was, to have a woman that withheld any complaints whatsoever, followed a man from job to job, never raise a complaint until he gets ready to be confirmed to the United States Supreme Court, raise allegations that can't possibly be denied or supplemented, verified, not effectively. You raise them 20 years plus. That's why we have laws on the books to protect from allegations too many years after the fact. We have statutes of limitations. If you sit on something and don't tell people for years and years, and then all of a sudden for political reasons you raise up allegations against someone who's basically defenseless. Thing is, Clarence Thomas was not defenseless. There were like 15 people, 15 women came forward, said, look, I was there around Anita Hill when those things were going on. Those things never happened. Clarence Thomas is a brilliant, fine man, over and over. Does any of that come up when HBO talks about him? Of course not, because they're out to slander him, libel him, make him appear to be some crazy guy. The guy is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Some say, well, yeah, of course, the only way he got into Harvard, which at the time was too conservative, he thought, for him, law school after Holy Cross, and then it was too conservative, and he ends up applying to Harvard or to Yale and going there. He didn't think quite as conservative. But he began to notice, as he points out in his book, that the liberals would talk to him about sports and oppression of black people in America, and that's all they wanted to talk about. But he began to notice that the two or three other conservatives, the few that there were in Yale at the time, Yale Law School, basically would talk to him about anything. And I've had a conversation prior years with him about that at Yale. But it is interesting. You know, the liberals say, oh, yeah, we're the ones that care. Now, you're only here because we push for affirmative action. You couldn't possibly be smart enough to be in a place where I am, the liberals think. So, yeah, it's on his own merit, on his own intellect. He deserves to be a member of the United States Supreme Court. He deserves the acclaim that he's never properly gotten. But people that have clerked at that court know the integrity, the intellect, the consistency of Clarence Thomas. He was maligned. They thought basically it was an effort to bork, as it's come to become a verb, what was done to Justice Bork. Accuse him of outrageous offenses, derail his confirmation so that this conservative, principled, qualified individual doesn't make it to the Supreme Court. Well, the effort worked on assassinating so grossly unfairly the character of Justice Bork, but it didn't work on Clarence Thomas because he is a man of steadfast faith, integrity, and not just the brilliant intellect. And it's really heartbreaking. I mean, I thought, even though I didn't support President Obama because I didn't want him taking a socialist road, a socialist health care road. He talked about these things. The videos were out there. He wanted to get us to where the government controlled health care, single payer, in other words, socialized medicine, where the government gets to decide whether you get health care or whether it's any good or not. And, of course, it ends up not being most of the time once the government has total unfettered control. I didn't want to go those places he wanted to go, but I thought the good thing is it shows that America is above racism, and this is a man who can bind up this nation as never before, and yet he has spent right at 8 years now creating more division in this country than we've had since the 60s. And who was stirring it up back then? Well, he was in the middle of groups that were stirring it up back in. Protege of Bill Ayers, first fundraiser he had in the home of someone who felt like it was a good idea to kill police, at least try to. I hear constant allegations that are so unfair. Those who know Jeff Sessions make some very fair observations. I noted the great fairness of someone with whom I disagree often, but Senator Susan Collins. This article from CNN Politics says a moderate Republican elected to the Senate the same year as Jeff Sessions in 1996 admits she and Sessions don't agree on a host of issues, but she was happy to accept Jeff Sessions' request to introduce him to the information hearing alongside senior Alabama Senator Richard Shelby. Quote, he's a decent, honorable, patriotic individual, unquote, Collins said in an interview in her Senate office. I felt bad. He was not getting a fair shake from those who were denigrating him. The main lawmaker, Susan Collins, is referring to allegations of racial insensitivity. Same Democrats used to block Sessions from moving through committee 30 years ago. Collins explained that she is basing her endorsement of Sessions' character on her own experience working with him over the past 20 years. Well, isn't that a good thing, Mr. Speaker? You have a senator that says, you know what, I'm not going to listen to the slings and arrows. I'm going to go based on the evidence that I have seen, heard, and known for myself. You can denigrate someone all you want, but we are going based on what's real, what's factual. And God bless her for doing so. Quote, I don't know what happened more than 30 years ago when Jeff was nominated to be a district court judge, and his nomination failed, unquote, she said. Quote, but I do know the Jeff Sessions that I've worked with in the past 20 years, and he's a good person. And I believe he will perform very well as the Attorney General. Another Republican colleague who went out of his way to get to know Jeff Sessions is Senator Tim Scott, the only African-American GOP senator. In December, Scott invited Sessions to visit his home state of South Carolina, where the two lawmakers met criminal justice professionals in Charleston. You know, I have such great regard for my colleagues across the aisle, but I am heartbroken that 30 years after the denial of Jeff Sessions a judicial bench, when the Jeff Sessions that I've come to know in the 12 years I've been in Congress, come to know him, I feel like, pretty well, he's a good, decent, fair man. He tries to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. He tries to treat people fairly and equally. So this quote from he was Assistant District Attorney Thomas Harrison, who had started in the helping prosecute regarding the lynching of an African 19-year-old, just horrific, 19-year-old African-American Michael Donald in Alabama. And the Assistant District Attorney Harrison at the time that prosecuted the case in state court, he was quoted as saying, Sessions asked what we needed, because Sessions was the U.S. Attorney. What they need, in other words, to go after the culprits that would do such a horrendous criminal act. And he says, I said, in order to get a capital murder conviction, we need these things. And he, talking about Jeff Sessions, said that in regard to whatever the federal agents did or the FBI did, he would make those things available. He would do that. I don't know, that's the kind of Jeff Sessions I've gotten to know over the years. And it's a little heartbreaking to hear allegations about a guy. I really like him. And then to hear allegations that I've heard made about me in a grossly unfair manner. And I can't explain all of the allegations that are so grossly unfair about Jeff Sessions, but I can address some of the things that have been alleged to make him unfit to be Attorney General that I know are ridiculous. One of the points that was made was regarding his concern or opposition to the new Voting Rights Act extension. I guess that's what they were talking about. And I know a great deal about that. That comes through the Judiciary Committee. And I know my friend, fellow Republican Jim Sensenbrenner, had reached an agreement with Democrat John Conyers and others, and they weren't letting amendments get through. And I was trying to make the point clear. If you want to save the Voting Rights Act, you can't keep punishing a state because they did something wrong 50 years ago. That's not constitutional. And if you insist on continuing to put these punitive positions in the Voting Rights Act, that will continue to punish southern states that have recorded these days, and it was pretty well true across the South, they had less racial disparity than places in the North, in Wisconsin, in Massachusetts, in California. And yet people from these other states, because they made a majority, said, we don't care that there's less racial disparateness in those southern states. There was harm 50 years ago, and there was, and it needed to be cleaned up. It desperately needed to be cleaned up, and we needed a Voting Rights Act in order to help cure the evils. But what was pushed through in a voting rights extension with my opposition, and I don't know what Jeff's arguments were, but I know how wrong it was. And I came down here, and my friend, and I mean that, my friend John Conyers was sitting right there, and it was toward the end of the year, and I said, look, I've talked to liberal law deans from different parts of the country, New York, California, Texas, and when we discuss what you've put in the Voting Rights Act, you're still treating states punitively that are now doing better than California, New York, Massachusetts, at least some districts in those states. Wisconsin had a district with a huge problem. You can't do that. It's going to be ruled unconstitutional, and I still cannot support it. But why don't we do a joint amendment and fix this? My friend John Conyers, he's a very honorable man. He said, let me talk to some of our folks. And when I talked to him before the end of the year, he said, we think it's okay, and the people I talked to think it's okay. We don't need to amend it. We're going to leave it just like it is. Well, it's wrong, whether it's in a Voting Rights Act, whether it's in a criminal bill, a civil bill. If you're punishing people for the sins of their grandfathers or fathers, it's wrong. It's un-American. And I don't know if Jeff Sessions has called something like that un-American, but I will. When you try to punish an individual for something their father or grandfather did, that is un-American. That's wrong. And lo and behold, the liberal law professors and deans that I've talked to across the country before I begged, well, I begged Jim Sensenbrenner. He was sitting at the back, right back there. He said, nope, we're not touching that bill. They were happy to let it go to the Supreme Court one day, just the way it was. And just as I explained to John Conyers right here, just as I explained to Jim Sensenbrenner right back there, this should be struck down if the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be fair, impartial, and follow the Constitution. You can't keep punishing people for something their fathers or grandfathers did when they are doing better than people in your own state, and you vote to punish them. Why? Because you can, and their fathers or grandfathers committed wrong many years ago. A grievous wrong it was, and it needed correction. And there's some places it still does, but you don't keep punishing people 50 years after they've cleaned up their problem. So when I hear people say Jeff Sessions is not fit because he opposed the Voting Rights Act, I tried to clean it up because it had an un-American provision in there. You shouldn't. I just can't believe anybody on either side of the aisle would continue to support the idea that we should punish children or grandchildren for something their father or grandfather did many years ago, and this child has become an adult, and they have made sure there's fairness abounding. Well, there's always going to be injustice. And one of the great problems in this Justice Department, it was always quick to take up for someone who had been shot by a policeman before they knew any of the facts and demonize the local police. And sometimes, rare cases, but every now and then, they did deserve demonizing. But a Department of Justice should not demonize them before we find out the facts. And in most of those cases, when we find out the facts, whether it's Baltimore or other places, most of the time, or even a law professor of some kind, the president said, acted stupidly talking about the policeman, acted himself very reasonably. We never did hear whether the president apologized to the policeman or not, but the point is the president and the Justice Department 8 years dividing us in ways I did not believe were possible 8 years ago. And so when I hear my friends come in here and start condemning a man as not being fit to serve because of things like opposing an unconstitutional, un-American provision in the Voting Rights Act, it was then, it is today, it would be if somebody tries to pass a punishment of some group of people for something their grandparents did. It's wrong. It's un-American. I'll say it till the day I die. Now, it is very unfair. I saw it as a felony judge, and it broke my heart. Never in chambers, but sometime in chambers, but never in the courtroom itself. It would bring me to tears. I'd break down when you see the suffering of children because of the sins of their parents. But the government should not be in the business of punishing people intentionally. And there was a provision in the Voting Rights Act that did just that. Now, I also heard allegation about Jeff Sessions either opposing a hate crime extension or a hate crime bill. And I can tell you from conversations I had years past, back when we were talking about hate crimes bills, we did not need hate crime laws. And what was the fake news that was trotted out here in Washington, trotted out around the country? Remember what happened down in South Texas? It wasn't in my district. I'm familiar with what happened down there. There were 3 people, 3 white guys, that took a poor, decent African-American, used a chain, tied him to their truck, and drug him till he was dead. As I've said in print and publicly before, I would personally have no problem with a jury ordering a sentence, if we could put it in the law, so that the family of that victim could decide what they were going to use to drag the defendant and the terrain they would drag those white defendants over. But that's not the law. And the law in Texas is that our juries can find you guilty of and sentence you. Well, the juries don't actually sentence to death. That's left to the judge. The juries answered 3 questions. I know I put it to juries 3 times. And on one occasion, the jury came back locked up, and so I sentenced that defendant to life. On 2 occasions of the 3 capital murder cases I tried to completion, the jury found unanimously, number 1, he committed the murder Number two, he knew that a murder was going to be committed and that he was a future, that was number two, he's a future danger to society. And number three was there was no evidence that mitigated the imposition, against the imposition of the death penalty. The jury comes back, yes, yes, and no, and it's left to a judge like me to look a man in the eyes and tell him that I sentence him to death. There is nothing that goes to your soul like looking someone in the eye and saying, you're going to be taken by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and you're going to be put to death for the crimes you have committed. I believe in the death penalty, but I believe with all my heart you have to make sure due process occurs. Could care less about race. And I hear these allegations about Jeff Sessions. And I know Jeff, and I know this is ridiculous. And I was, as I was listening to some of these broad statements, just taking a swat at Jeff Sessions, a really fine, decent man. And it took me right back to 20 years or so ago when I was that felony district judge in Texas. And I'd tried capital murder cases, and never mind the fact that I was court appointed to appeal the capital murder conviction of an African-American man, and I did everything I possibly could ethically and within the law for my client, who I believe was wrongly convicted in that case, and his case was overturned after our argument, my argument. I was the only one to argue for our side. I was the one that solely did the brief, even though the family paid a lot, thousands of dollars to somebody from another state. I did the whole thing. I did it all. I didn't have a clerk do it. I did it all. And his capital murder conviction was reversed. He used to bring me wonderful food. I loved her, went to her funeral. She was just an incredible Christian woman, and her funeral did her justice. Of course, then her daughter ran against me for Congress 3 times, but that's another story. But nonetheless, I can remember back when I was a felony judge, and I got served with a subpoena by a defense lawyer, and they had taken the position in a pleading in another court that because I had allegedly appointed a disparate number of white people to be grand jury foremen over African Americans, then I must be bigoted, and therefore convictions in Smith County should be overturned. And I think they subpoenaed another district judge or two. We had 3. And I knew that lawyer. He knew I wasn't a racist. And he subpoenaed me and made allegations in print before he even knew who had been on my grand juries during those years I was a felony district judge. But he made the broad-based allegation, must be racist and got to throw out these cases. And before I came to testify, he actually got the list of my grand jurors. And I didn't get to choose the grand jurors. Those were chosen by grand jury commissioners. They chose the grand jury members, the commissioners did. All I did was I got to choose the grand jury foreman. I didn't care about race. I didn't care about gender. I appointed people because when I looked at the background, the little bios we had on each of the grand jury members, I wanted somebody that was going to be a leader on that grand jury. I didn't care about race. And when the criminal defense lawyers did their homework after they made allegations, they notified me that I would not be called as a witness because I'd appointed too many African-American grand jury foremen, and therefore I had appointed, it was a disparate number of African-Americans. It was too many, and therefore I would hurt their case because I would show maybe I was more biased for African-Americans than against them. And I didn't care about race. And I can remember a couple of grand jury foremen. One of them, he was, I think, assistant school superintendent. I knew the guy. He was a solid citizen, and I'd seen him in action. He was a real leader in the community, and he was an honest, fair man. I thought he'll be great as a grand jury foreman, and he was. But probably the best grand jury foreman I ever appointed, she was a saint. Her name was Ms. Glass, and I knew enough about her. When I saw she was on the grand jury, I knew she'd been. And that woman was a saint, and she was organized, and she called things like they were, and you couldn't help but fall in love with Ms. Glass if you were around her for any length of time at all. But anyway, those memories, getting a subpoena alleging that I'm a racist, until they actually did their homework and found out, whoops, he may be too pro-African American. We don't want him to testify. I got that same feeling when I was hearing those allegations against Jeff Sessions. It's not based on facts. We just had the feeling that maybe he was being unfair. I think somebody mentioned the Southern Poverty Law Center, Southern something, but I know the Southern Poverty Law Center, my opinion, after they incited hatred against the Family Research Council, they incited hatred against other people. The Southern Poverty Law Center, they were supposed to be the antithesis of hate. And yet they stirred up a guy so much that he would go into their lobby and try to kill people at the Family Research Center. And it's more of this craziness. And the Bible warns us of a day when up will be down, right will be wrong. And I keep wondering, are we there? Because, we hear from people at the Civil Rights Commission that maybe Christians are the big hate group in the country. Really? It's the only religion that's truly based on love. Because to be a Christian, you have to believe God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in the son would not perish but have everlasting life. And then his son so loved the world that he laid down his life for people, even as they called him names and mocked him. It's a religion of love. It's not a religion of hate. And yet, right is wrong, up is down. Let's call somebody that wants justice and fairness a racist. Really? Is that fair? So supposedly, Jeff Sessions, I think this was alleged at him at one point, that Jeff Sessions is not fit to serve as Attorney General because he's for vouchers. Mr. Speaker, when you hear from African Americans here in Washington, D.C., about how their children have suffered under horrendous gang conditions in a school, and then for this Camelot-type moment, they got vouchers. They won the lottery. They got vouchers that Republicans pushed for. And they got to go to great schools. And these kids that have been oppressed and shoved in either being in gangs or dealing with gangs, they got to go get a good education because they got a voucher. And when you have an African-American mom cry before you and say, do my other kids, are they going to have to go face the gangs? Why can't they go be a doctor and engineer? I don't think it's hate. I don't think it's prejudice that has your heart ache for a mom like that and says, yeah, why don't we give moms and dads, whoever's taking care of the kids, let's give parents money, you go to the school. And it's not an indictment of public schools. We didn't have kindergarten. All 12 years of mine were in public schools. I had fantastic teachers, incredible, inspiring. Since I was going to major in history at A&M on Army scholarship, so it didn't matter much what I majored in. I knew I was going to the Army for 4 years. I hope to go to law school someday if we weren't at war. But my math teachers in public school, 7th grade, Ms. Edwards, high school, I had fantastic math teachers, although some students didn't like. I loved it. They were great. College algebra. We had a professor that let us either turn in our homework that we had to do for it was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, turn in the homework, or he would give you one question at the beginning of each class. If you didn't want to do it wrong, you got a 0 for the day. I didn't open my book till 15 minutes before the final. I never did the homework because my 7th grade, Ms. Edwards, and all my math teachers in high school were so good. I had the foundation. It was there. Of course, I enjoyed math, but made an A. It was easy because of the public school training I got. But not every public school has that advantage. I had the advantage of having an 8th grade English teacher for a mother, and she was in public school until the brain tumor took her out. And that is you come home after football practice, I'm going to go lay down. I'm exhausted, Mom. Oh, what are you going to lay when you get there? Okay, all right, I'm going to lie down. Are you happy? Just cut me some slack. I'm going to go lie down. Well, that's living with a public school teacher. I miss her, love her. But because I think, or if Jeff Sessions feels the same way, I think he may, heck, if schools are not teaching children to read and write so they can excel and become president of their company or president of the country, then let them go to a school. And I think public schools will end up winning out. They've got the wherewithal to have the best schools. They just don't have any incentives. And that was the purpose of vouchers, provide incentive. I've heard the allegation that Trump, was a birther. And I haven't had a lot of conversations with Trump. I've had a number of them. But my impression was that he never said that, and maybe he did. I just didn't hear him say Obama was not born in America. But I know I've heard people say repeatedly that I, Louie Gohmert, am a birther, which is a lie. I've never, ever, ever said that. And yet it became such a credo of the left. Some guy on Fox News one night, I think he was on Megyn Kelly, Democratic consultant. She says, tell me somebody that hates, well, Louie Gohmert's a birther, he said. And if I recall correctly, I'm pretty sure I do, he later an article, okay, Gohmert never actually said that Barack Obama was not an American citizen, but he did support the birther bill, and therefore he is a birther. Well, that takes me back to August, I guess it was July of 2009, I believe it was. And my friend Bill Posey from Florida had a little 2-page bill, may have been 2 and just a hair at the top of the 3rd page. I think it was a little bit at the top of the 3rd page, just over 2 pages. And it was a good bill. I read the bill. I try to do that before I'll ever agree to support a bill. And I read the bill. And I recall that the New York Times and the Washington Post, I think around January of 2008, raised the issue of whether or not John McCain was qualified under the Constitution to be President of the United States, because apparently he was born in the Panama Canal Zone. And therefore, is that being, a natural citizen born in the Canal Zone? His dad was, he was in the Navy, military. He would, so, maybe so, maybe. They raised the issue. New York Times, Washington Post. And I was in Israel during August when I got word that I was being accused of being a birther. And I can recall out here in the speaker's lobby, a whole slew of reporters wanting to know about my being a birther. And one of them at the time was with the Washington Post. A good reporter, and that's why she's not there now. And I couldn't believe, it was kind of et tu, Brutus. Really? You think I'm a birther? And she said, well, I understand from the White House that you signed on the bill, and if I recall the words correctly, it was to delegitimize the president and have him thrown out of office. And I said, wow, whatever, I think that was the words, it was something like that. But it was exactly the words that every reporter approached me were using. You're trying to delegitimize the president and have him thrown out of office? And I think Doonesbury used words like that. And so when this one reporter caught me in another place and said, I understand you're a birther, you're on the birther bill? And I said, are you talking about Bill Posey's bill? And she said, yeah, the birther bill. And I said, have you read it? And she said, well, no, but I know it's trying to delegitimize the president, have him thrown out of office. And I said, tell you what, I haven't been giving statements to these ridiculous allegations. I think I gave a written one I dictated from Israel, but when I was here, it was just absurd. And I said, I tell you what, you read the Posey bill. It's just barely over 2 pages. You read that bill, and if you still want a statement from me, I'll give you as long a statement as you want. The next time I saw her, I said, did you read the Posey bill? And she said, yeah, it didn't do anything they said it was going to do. Exactly. It was a very well-conceived. It was not a birther bill, but in the mind of Rahm Emanuel, he saw it as an opportunity to allege that someone was racist, birther, accusing the president of not being an American citizen. Because my thought was, well, if he's born to an American mother, what difference does it make? Is it really? But I did still find it interesting that the president wouldn't come forward as anybody else in America would and say, here's my birth certificate. It took Donald Trump making a demand for him to finally come forward. Who knows if that's the right one or not. But I never had any issue with Barack Obama being an American citizen. Didn't have any question. I do think he should have come forward and shut down the noise much sooner. But I think he and Rahm Emanuel liked using that and liked to call people like me a birther, even though it was an absolute lie. I never believed the president was not an American citizen. But yes, I signed on to that Bill Posey bill. And what Bill Posey's bill, that's been for 11 years now. Well, no, I'm sorry, 8 years now. 8 years now, it's been called a birther bill. All it did, anybody can go read Posey's bill from back in 2009. It said before a candidate for his or her party's nomination or pursues his or her nomination for president, the party must make a determination that that individual meets the qualifications of the Constitution. And it would not kick in until 2012. So the crud these reporters were getting from somebody in the White House, maybe Rahm Emanuel, who knows? Sounded like Rahm. But whoever sent them the information, whoever sent Gary Trudeau the false lies that he used for a strip, never bothered to read the bill and see that the allegations of birtherism, whatever that is, was just a lie. It said beginning in 2012. Nobody was trying to get anybody thrown out of office, but that made perfect sense. So that next time the Washington Post and the New York Times raised an issue of whether or not somebody like John McCain was really qualified to be president, you would get it resolved long before that person got elected president. I couldn't imagine a worse horror for America than to have someone elected president and then get thrown out after they're elected. We're talking about massive riots. We're talking about destroying this country, just dividing it even worse than this administration has been able to do on its own. I didn't want to yank a president out of office, but I thought Bill Posey thought of a very fair way to do with it. And by the way, those that were concerned about my friend Ted Cruz being appropriate to be president, meeting the constitutional requirements, I thought, well, gosh, if the left hadn't so demonized Bill Posey's bill, he had the framework that would get this all out of the way long before you ever got to a party nomination, so that the party had it all resolved and you couldn't come in at the last minute after the nomination saying, nope, you didn't go to it would take care of it. And I've had a Supreme Court justice say, gee, if there's no legislation that sets up a foundation for or an enabling process, then don't come running to the Supreme Court. If you're not going to do your job and set it up or have enabling legislation come out of Congress, don't come running to us to fix what you're not doing. And he wasn't talking about anything specific, but I thought about those comments. Well, great. The Posey bill would be terrific enabling legislation. And if the White House hadn't so freaked out over Bill Posey's legitimate bill, the Ted Cruz issue would not have been an issue at all. It would have been long determined, long before we got into a heated race in the primary, because before a party chair could accept the application to become a candidate, had to determine whether or not that candidate meets the constitutional requirements. And if somebody wanted to challenge, then they'd need to come forward and do it at that point. And you get it all worked out. It was a good bill. But poor Bill Posey, he's been so vilified for coming up with a good idea that was branded as racist birther. It was a really legitimate bill. And I keep coming back to this. It reminds me of what I'm hearing being said about Jeff Sessions, a very decent man. I don't know, I don't try to push my religious beliefs on others, but it's a part of who I am as a Christian. I try to forgive others, and I've been amazed by the grace of God how I've been able to forgive people that have really jerked me around, and even work with some people that have really stabbed me before. But I've been amazed. Jeff Sessions was called all kinds of things in 1986. Yet 10 years later, he's elected to the Senate. He never sought any kind of revenge against those who did him so unfairly and unjustly because he cared about justice and doing the right thing. This country needs to heal. And if people are going to keep screaming racism, when it appears the biggest source of racism may have been all those people that told me, well, I wanted to vote for the first black American in our history, and I really didn't know much about politics. You mean you voted for someone because of the color of their skin? Yes, I wanted to be able to tell future generations I voted for the first black president. I wanted to do that too. And that's why I voted for Alan Keyes in 1996. Sorry, Phil Graham, I know you're from my state, but I just really thought a lot of the intellect and integrity of Alan Keyes, and I still do. That's why his son works for me. He is brilliant, fair, smart, pretty doggone funny too. But we don't care about race, and we need to quit throwing this racist term about. Enough already. Let's give Jeff Sessions a fair hearing. Let's look at what his record really is. And if he, like I did, opposed an unconstitutional punishment of a future generation who had done no wrong for something grandparents had done, then he's right. That's unconstitutional. It is un-American. And I am grateful that Donald Trump has nominated a man like Jeff Sessions for the Senate.